What's up, everyone? So, in today's episode, we're going to revisit a topic that I think I've done a podcast on before. I think I did one way early on before it was even the Landlord Chick podcast when it was a totally different name. I know I've done a blog or two about it, and I have actually years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, taught a course on this topic as well. But today we're going to talk about partnerships, and there's a lot to talk about with partnerships. I could easily probably create 3 40-minute episodes on partnerships alone. And in today's episode, we're kind of focus on the initial stages. So the idea of finding a partner, getting it started, all the legal things about it, and then also just how to make sure you find the right fit for yourself and for your career. So we're going to stick with those today. I may eventually get into what I call sort of the second section and the third section regarding partnerships. Another issue or section of it is issues with partnerships that might come up. And then the other part of it that I sometimes like to talk about is when it's time for growth. So maybe one of you leaves the partnership or you bring in a third partner into it. How do you kind of handle that? How do things change? So you can see there's a lot with partnerships, but today we're going to talk about the initial stages of it all. Building a real estate portfolio is as much about buying properties as being a de facto entrepreneur. I'm Karina Ufinger. I'm a multi-property investor, rental management company CEO, and also a landlord coach. I'm going to show you the systems and knowledge you need to thrive as a real estate entrepreneur. From your first property purchase to building a portfolio of passive income where you work less than 5 hours a week, you'll learn the essential information and skills to build a profitable portfolio and live the life you truly want. Whether you are well on your journey or just starting out, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Landlord Chick podcast. All right, let's get into this conversation about partnerships. One thing I want to kind of say from the get-go is I very much look at partnerships like a marriage, especially in terms of if you're doing buy and hold. These are absolutely like a long-term friendship, arrangement, partnership. This is not something that is anything that should be taken lightly. That being said, we've all seen the writing on the wall that partnerships are a great way to scale your portfolio quickly. And it makes sense. At its most basic description, a partnership helps you bring to the table what you lack. That's really what partnerships are all about. Whether you are deficient, where you are deficient, you can bring someone in who offsets that deficiency. So it doesn't matter if you're deficient in something that is intangible, like a personality trait that isn't so great in regards to real estate, or maybe you don't have experience in what you're trying to do, or if it's a tangible deficiency, if it's credit score or money. A partnership is a great way to overcome what you aren't able to bring to the table. Yet, how do we create a partnership that will solve these issues and not blow up in your face? That's the key part. We want to create a partnership that is not only going to help fill those gaps, but it's going to end up being at least fruitful for a couple years. Now, it might not be a lifetime long-lasting one in the sense of 20 years, but we want it to last a couple years. So how do we build that foundation to ensure that the partnership that we are agreeing to is going to make sense for us, it's going to be efficient for us, and that it's going to be structured properly? That's what we're going to talk about today. So I did say entering into a partnership on a real estate deal with buy and holds is like entering into a marriage contract. In these instances, you are likely forming an LLC with a person. So you are entering into a formal long-term arrangement that's going to be recognized by a government entity. So take it seriously. Just like you hopefully wouldn't tie the knot with someone after meeting them over a weekend at a bar, don't do the same thing with partnerships. Don't meet someone at a networking event, a seminar, a business seminar, and then be like, hey, let's go into partnership together. Partnerships are always best done with people that you know a fairly deep amount about. Now, not necessarily their hopes and dreams for their lives in general. You don't need to know all those intimate details, but it does require knowing them beyond a casual acquaintance at a networking event. You want to know how they operate their lives. You want to know what they consider priorities. You want to know their working style and what demands they have on their time. For instance, will it mesh with your vision of a partnership if the person you're partnering with has a demanding job that's 60 hours a week? What if on top of the 60 hours a week, they travel a lot for that job? Maybe they're gone 2.5 weeks out of the month. Does that affect your feelings about entering into a partnership with that person? If they like to work really hard during the week and on the evenings, but then they rip the town open and paint it flippin' red on Friday and Saturday, are you able to work with that person? Does that bother you? Now, I'm not saying that any of these particular situations are ones that you should avoid. It's a personal decision. You need to know ahead of time what works for you in a partnership and what doesn't. So, one of the first things you want to do before you necessarily start thinking about sizing people up for a partnership is think about what you want out of it. What do you expect your partner to do? How do you expect them to behave? Not just within the partnership, but outside of it. Now, obviously, you shouldn't get too in deep in their entire personal life because when it comes down to it, probably 60% of that's not going to matter. The part you're going to focus on is how they operate on a day-to-day basis. Are they someone who goes to work and then comes home and Netflix and chills for 4 hours, and maybe they devote, 6 hours a week to real estate? Is that going to work for you? Probably, honestly not. You're going to want a partner who's going to put a little bit more into it than just 6 hours, I have a feeling. And again, are you okay with somebody maybe works really hard during the week, but then parties it up on the weekend? You need to figure out what you want from this partnership and what your expectations are for how you might interact with that person. Once you know what you kind of want from it, then you can start informally interviewing people and sizing them up. Now, this is again not something you're going to walk up to them and say, "Hey, do you want to partner with me?" This is again be somebody that you've gotten to know over a couple weeks, maybe even a couple months, possibly even a couple years. Maybe you've known somebody for a couple years. Maybe you're a little late to the game of getting started, or you need a new partnership because the one you had before, they're not interested in going that direction. So you need a whole new partner for different things. Once you know what you want, then you can start getting an idea of sizing people up to see if generally they're going to start to fit what you would like out of this partnership. Once you've found that person that you know you can work with well on a long-term basis, you feel a little bit of a camaraderie personally, but professionally, you're really sort of on the same page. Then you're probably going to need to start thinking about specifically your expectations and your goals. So when entering into a partnership, it's important to be clear about what you expect out of your partner and where that real estate journey is going. Things that should definitely be talked about before making anything formal, and certainly towards the beginning stages of talks, is potential target markets. So you should be agreeing upon areas that you want to be in, areas you don't want to be in. Maybe it's as simple as, are you okay going out of state, or do you want to stick in state? Are there certain markets in a particular state you want to avoid? These are things that you should have discussed out ahead of time before formally entering into that partnership. You also want to talk about what your overall strategy is. Do you want to do BRRRRs, turnkeys, both? Make sure you're kind of on the same page with that. Are you both looking at the same ultimate goal in real estate? If you find yourself disagreeing on the ultimate goal, a few markets, or even whether to do investing in a particular strategy, it doesn't mean the partner isn't viable. It just means that you and the partner must go into it understanding that one or both of you may do some investing on the side outside of the LLC, or that maybe it's a sort of limited time event, meaning maybe it's not meant to last for 10 years. Maybe it's just a 5-year thing. Maybe it's just a 7-year thing. It's just not a long-term partnership. So it's totally fine if your goals and your expectations don't mesh up completely. If you find some common ground for the beginning, it's a great way to start propelling your real estate career forward. So definitely don't disqualify them because they don't agree on maybe owning 46 units versus owning, 75. Or maybe one of the partners wants to go just strictly small multifamily, while the other one is interested in ultimately getting up to medium-sized multifamily. Those aren't any sort of issues that should kill a partnership right off the bat. There's really only one decision that I feel should kill a partnership right off the bat once you've actually sort of vetted the person. And that is if you can't agree on the type of entity to set up for your real estate. But when you're having these initial conversations, you're discussing your goals, your expectations, what you want to get into in real estate. As long as you're not disagreeing on everything, take what you're disagreeing about and sort of pull it out of the equation and set that aside. Look at what you do have in common. Does the partnership still make sense based on everything you still have in common? So maybe you still agree that you want to do BRRRRs. Maybe you still agree that you want to do small multifamily. But maybe your partner doesn't agree in doing out-of-state investing, but they're okay for doing it in the state that you live in. That's still a great partnership. It's still a viable partnership. You just know that you won't be doing any out-of-state investing within that entity, within that partnership. So now we found our partner. We've kind of discussed our goals and our expectations. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of deciding roles. It makes any partnership more efficient and less complicated if there is a clear division of roles and responsibilities. It avoids duplication, overlap, things falling through the cracks, and in some instances, having too many cooks in a kitchen. A really good way to think about this is if you've ever watched any reality programming on running restaurants, or you've seen a movie or two about maybe a main character is a restaurant, they work in a high-end restaurant, they've got chefs, there's a chef, there's a cook that kind of works under them. It's a good analogy for this. So when we talk about having too many cooks in a kitchen, when you work in a restaurant kitchen, a high-end one, you likely have someone who is called the head chef. Then the head chef has sous chefs and then even just regular cooks that work beneath them. But there's this one person who is the chef who makes the majority of the decisions. Now, in some restaurants, you might have a head chef for entrees and then a head chef for desserts. The head chef for desserts has the same structure. They might have a sous chef or two, maybe a few general cooks, but they have purview over the dessert menu. The main entree chef has purview over the main entrees. Sure, they have to come together and kind of mesh, have maybe some common flavors and themes going on across the dishes, but they have purview over their own areas of responsibility. We're taking that and we're applying that to real estate partnerships. But there should be some aspects that you work jointly on or have an equal say in. Now, we're going to talk about some of the areas first that can be divided up. Now, the things that you divide up, it's a good time to take stock of what your talents or skills are, because that's a great way to sort of delegate the items that maybe don't speak to your talents. Great example of this is maybe you are someone who just isn't good with people. You probably don't want to be the one in charge of leasing. You maybe don't want to be the person in charge of tenant relations or tenant management. Those should likely try and be delegated to your partner. And hopefully, if you knew that was your downfall, you sought a partner that would fill that role great, that they would love talking to people, that they love handling the tenants for the most part. Obviously at every point we all start to roll our eyes a little bit. But generally speaking, you should have found a partner that is going to complement your lack of wanting to work with tenants. So some of the things that we're going to maybe divide amongst us in a very general terms: bookkeeping, deal finding, finding funding, design aesthetics, contractor coordination, day-to-day tenant operations. Those are some of the things that can kind of clearly be delegated and defined across. Now, in some instances, you might find that maybe one person shouldn't do something within one of those header columns. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to do those things. You could certainly say, you're going to be in charge of bookkeeping, but I know you have trouble with putting down the hammer on delinquency. So I'm going to go ahead and take over getting payments if someone's in delinquency. Totally fine to divide it up like that. Because again, you're kind of speaking to each other's, I don't know if it's a talent, but you're speaking to what your positives are. So your positive is you don't have a problem sort of throwing down the hammer and getting rent collected. So it's perfectly fine for you to take over that one small aspect of bookkeeping, but then have your partner do the rest of it. There's also going to be aspects that you should be equally a part of. And these are really sort of, I honestly say, the big three. So the big three are property purchases, funding decisions, and your purchase criteria. So the three things that you should always have an equal say in can also be delegated, but at some point you should be coming back to the table to make a mutual decision. So maybe you do have property purchases delegated, somebody's finding deals. But in reality, you both should be coming back to the table and making a decision about which properties are bought and which ones are not. So these are areas that you definitely want to make sure you both have the understanding that it's a 50-50 decision. That doesn't mean there won't be compromising involved, but no one should necessarily act unilaterally in those three areas. Now, it's important to understand that there are times that having too many cooks in the kitchen with decisions can really sort of become a dam. They can really sort of prevent the flow from going down the river and making progress. One of the best examples I have for this is having both people making design choices. Now, even if you're not flipping, when you turn over a unit, you do a rehab, there's likely going to be some design decisions to be made. What flooring are you going to use? What paint color are you going to use? Which tub are you going to put in? This is something that I highly recommend that you put one person in charge of making these decisions. So you just decide from the get-go that this person is in charge of picking out the design aesthetics. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have say necessarily over whether they use vinyl sheet or LVP, luxury vinyl plank. But once you've made that decision of the type of flooring you're going with, the actual one that's picked out should be left to that person who has the delegated responsibility. What type of flooring speaks to the larger picture of the direction of the portfolio, the particular choice in color or pattern is something that can definitely be left up to one person. So make sure that you don't have to have an equal say in decisions that could easily become just basically a snowball of decisions that are holding up the rest of the portfolio, the rest of the progress. Now, we've decided who's doing what. We've talked about our goals and our expectations. So we likely are at this point of deciding, hey, this is the person I want to partner with. We're going to make it formal. Now, one of the first things you're going to want to do is decide how you're going to invest. It's kind of common. No, I'm going to say it's common, and this kind of bothers me that it is common, but it's common when you're investing with your spouse or just by yourself to buy properties as a sole proprietor doing business as. I'm not a fan of it for individuals or partner or for marriages. I'm definitely not a fan of it for partnerships. So the reason I don't like that in general is because you really have no legal protection. That's basically what the first thing boils down to. When you buy property and you are leasing and you are doing everything as, let's say, Catherine Walker, because that's your name, there's no protections as far as where your liability ends. That's why I kind of cringe when I see people buying properties and doing Catherine Walker, doing business as Walker Properties. It really should be Walker Properties LLC. That should be an LLC. You should have that protection for yourself. But I'm going to get off my horse about that, and I'm going to save that for another podcast sometime. So when you found your partner, you're going to want to start to make it formal. You're going to want to make it legal. Kind of like, when you find your perfect life partner, sometimes you might want to make it legal. So you're entering this phase, you're going to want to consider what legal entity you're going to create, because you're not going to be doing a sole proprietor for this. Let's just get this clear. You're not going to be doing a sole proprietor for this. In some states, you actually technically can't really do a sole proprietor for it when you have more than one owner that's not related. I forget which states it is. So obviously research your states, but there's a few states where it's like a non-discussion to even be able to do a sole proprietorship. Now, when you are entering into this agreement, you're going to decide limited liability corporation, LLC, limited liability partnership, LLP, or corporation. The most common one and the easiest, more or less, to set up is an LLC. LLCs are probably the most common, like 9 times out of 10, if there's a partnership, it's an LLC. Whether or not that fits for you is not a decision that should come out of this podcast. That's actually something that should be considered with your partner, as well as with an attorney that is licensed in the state you're going to be incorporating in. And that's the key there, where you're going to be incorporating in. You want to have an attorney advise you on what the best is for your situation based on where you're physically going to be incorporating that entity, not necessarily where you're going to be buying property. Because, of course, if you have really big goals, you might not buy property in just one state. You might buy them in multiple states. But you definitely want to consult an attorney with your partner about what's going to be the best entity for you, because it can vary by state, what the tax laws are, what the liability protections are. In some states, the LLP is taxed at a higher rate than an LLC. A corporation, generally speaking, you tend to not have a lot of limited liability protection, but yet your tax rate is usually rather low on it. So these are all things that you want to discuss with an attorney and an accountant, likely, that is licensed in the state that you're incorporating in. I know people like to, especially for accountants, maybe think accountants can be online and they can be from anywhere. When you're making key decisions like this, it's really important to have an accountant that knows the particulars of your state. So go local for that. Absolutely go local when you're looking at getting advice for LLC entities, anything like that. So now you've likely consulted someone, you've figured out the entity that you want to get into. And again, going back to our conversation before, if you can't agree upon what entity to incorporate into, that is a sign you should not be entering into that agreement. If you had differences that were so stark to begin with in regards to taxes versus liability coverage, that is someone that is obviously not on the same wavelength with you, and they are not on the same wavelength with you in very important ways. So if you can't come to terms on the type of structure, you definitely need to be finding a new partner. Now, when you filed your entity, you likely filed what's called documents of incorporation, something to that effect. All what those did was basically said, we're here, this is who we are, this is what we do. You still need documentation that is more or less meant for the benefit of the two partners. As far as who's doing what, who brought what to the table, you need your prenup. You need an operating agreement. Your operating agreement is your prenuptial agreement where you're discussing what you already have, what you're bringing to the table, and what you're expecting from other people. Now, you might be thinking, wait, this isn't covered in prenups. All what I can say is if you need some mindless reading, just start Googling like Kardashian prenups or something like that. Like when you need to just get out of your own head for a moment, just start Googling prenups for like Bruce Willis, the Kardashians, and you'll see that there are actually prenups out there that have expectations of certain roles. And I'm not just talking about in the bedroom, by the way. I'm talking about there's ones where there's expectations where I forgot who it was, but one of them actually had the expectation that the one of them, I'm pretty sure it was a woman, was going to be in charge of meals no matter what. Like she had to order dinner, she had to cook dinner. I'm not making this up. I really wish I could remember which one it was. But yes, there are prenups that get this specific. All right. So now let's get back to real estate though. So you're going to create your operating agreement, your prenuptial agreement, and a partnership. It's where you outline who is responsible for what happens if one person wants to leave, and who brought what to the table. Now, here's the thing. Depending on what state you're in, it can be really, really important to cover what happens in the event of a death of a partner. How probate works varies from state to state. Probate in New York works much different from probate here in Wisconsin. So it's always a good idea to have it include what happens to the partnership in the event of the death of the partner. And that's a conversation that's an entirely different podcast. So in this operating agreement, we want to include who brought what to the table. So this is mostly used for the purpose of recording in the partnership unequal contributions to down payment, rehab costs, and also if one partner was on a mortgage, but the other one was not. So we're talking mostly the items that are a tangible, specific monetary value. You may also include if one partner was mostly responsible for securing the finances, like I said. And this is especially true in the case of traditional financing. The reason you want that in there, the big reason that you want that in there, is because it's going to help with another clause that should be in there in this instance. If you have someone, let's create this fictitious investing couple. Let's call them Henry and Catherine. And even though I said couple, they're not involved. They're not married. They're just two people that want to get into real estate, and they basically bring to the table what the other one doesn't. So let's say that Catherine is in a not so great financial situation. Her getting a loan is pretty difficult. And it also turns out that even when she's partnered with Henry, the terms that they're offered kind of aren't so great, but they could get great terms if it was just Henry on the mortgage. It's possible in some states for Henry to be the one to get the mortgage. Catherine's not on the mortgage, but she's on the deed because she's part of the LLC, or she's even listed on the deed in name. Now, it's possible in some states, not every state. Some states you have to be married to make that happen, where you would be on the deed but not on the mortgage. So again, this is getting into state-specific stuff that I feel like almost every podcast I'm saying, check your state statutes, talk with people in your state. But that can vary a little bit. But in the event that you have Henry securing financing and Catherine's not on that mortgage, it's going to be very critical for you to have in there that Catherine is entitled to being consulted on decisions regarding the financing of the property. Because otherwise, without that language in there, Henry being the mortgage holder, he almost has 100% control over what goes on over there. So if he refinances to a different rate, if he changes banks, that's all stuff that would otherwise just be within Henry's purview because he's the one that has the mortgage. So to protect Catherine, we want to be sure and have that clause in there that any mortgage that affects the property, the LLC, they must come to agreement on terms. Henry cannot act unilaterally in those decisions, despite being the mortgage holder. The other thing we're going to include in here is you'll also include a general description of who does what. You don't need to go into detail, but it should be all-encompassing. So let's go back to our two partners here, Henry and Catherine. Henry is responsible for finding the deals, tenant management, and arranging contractors. Catherine is in charge of the business bookkeeping, not tenant related, setting up financials, setting up financing for the deals, and because Henry hates doing showings, he doesn't hate tenants, but he hates doing showings. Catherine's going to take care of the leasing. In their operating agreement, it will be structured that Henry is taking care of finding the deals, tenant management, including tenant rent collection, and arranging contractors. Catherine is in charge of the business bookkeeping, which is not the portion done by Henry, which is she does not do tenant rent collection. She's in charge of setting up the financing for deals, and she's also going to be in charge of leasing. As we mentioned above, you also want protection from a partner making unilateral decisions. We just talked about that. So it's very important that as well in this section, you devote some language to saying that there are certain areas that the partners need to have an equal say in, that there needs to be a mutual decision. And these are the ones we talked about earlier on. We're talking about agreeing to what type of financing to use, what property purchase. Sure, maybe Henry is in charge of finding the deals, but he can't enter into a purchase agreement or make an offer without consulting Catherine. That needs to be covered in the language. Flip side of it, yes, Catherine's out there finding financing, but she can't enter into financing without giving Henry the option to speak up and have his voice heard. She cannot make a unilateral decision on that. So as we talked about, you don't want to have one partner who can refinance just because they're on the loan and the other one's not on the loan. Make sure that's covered in there. The other thing you want to be sure is covered in there is that while the partners are allowed to do real estate activities outside of the LLC, those activities can never put the LLC or its property up as collateral or any sort of guarantee. It also makes it much simpler if you clarify that any equity that exists in the properties cannot be used for activities outside of the LLC. So the first one, we're talking about not setting up the LLC or as collateral. We're not setting up the LLC as collateral for anything we're doing outside of that partnership. So we aren't securing a loan or anything using what exists in the LLC or the LLC itself. The other thing we're not doing is we're not pulling equity out and using it for other purposes for real estate or other purposes in general. We're only using the equity that exists in there for the growth of that LLC and that partnership. It can get really, really confusing if you start allowing partners to take equity out for other ventures. So I really recommend just in the beginning that you just have the rule that any equity that exists in the portfolio has to be used for the betterment of the portfolio. It's just going to make your life so much easier. So now that we've figured out in this operating agreement, we got all this awesome stuff outlined. You can't use the equity for outside things. You know who's doing what. You know who brought what to the table. This works great. But let's say 18 months later, you're ready to do a new deal. And maybe things have changed. So let's look at Henry and Catherine again. Let's say Henry did have 90% of the down payment the first time. 18 months later, Catherine's in a better position monetarily. She can actually start putting more money into the down payment. So what we can do in that instance is we can do an addendum to the operating agreement that is specific for the property at 1722 Birch Drive in Fargo, North Dakota. I'm realizing I use North Dakota a lot in this podcast, but I've never been to North Dakota, nor do I have, honestly, no offense to North Dakota. It's not necessarily on my must travel to list. So it's really interesting. They keep coming back to my mind. But anyway, so now we have Catherine in a better position. We're going to make sure that it's documented in an operating agreement addendum that in this specific property on Birch Drive, she brought more down payment than she did previously. It's totally fine for those elements to change and create an addendum for those by property. What you don't want to necessarily change by property is who's doing what. It just always makes the most sense if the same person is always in charge of tenant relations for every property, or they're always in charge of leasing for every property, or someone's always in charge of the bookkeeping and it's for all the properties. Those are the things that it's really best that, unless of course you discover someone doesn't really do too great of a job at it, it's best to leave them where they are, no matter what the property is. You can certainly make a change. Maybe they find out that Henry is not so great at finding deals. Maybe Catherine will be better than that. They can kind of swap that. So maybe in exchange, Catherine takes over finding deals and Henry takes over maybe doing the bookkeeping. That is something you can also address with an addendum to your operating agreement. But that's something that should be across the board and not property specific. Now, the other thing I want to say in regards to partnerships, LLCs, and this gets back to our earlier conversation, that sometimes maybe in the beginning you'll find out your ultimate goals aren't going the same direction. This is why we have in the operating agreement that it's totally fine for you to do real estate activities outside of the partnership. Let's bring Henry and Catherine back into this again. Henry and Catherine, they're doing a great job 5 years down the road. They've got, let's say, 24 small multifamily units. Catherine has her eyes on bigger fish. Henry's like, no, I'm really good with doing small multifamily and just getting properties that way. Well, we've gotten the LLC agreement or the operating agreement that Catherine can absolutely go out there and do other real estate ventures. She just can't put anything from her partnership with Henry up as collateral or guarantee. And she can't use the equity in it. But she's absolutely able to go out there and do her own thing. In that instance, Catherine is definitely going to be creating a new LLC. If she brings in a partner, she's definitely going to be creating another LLC. And that's totally fine. I'm someone who actually at this moment, I believe, has 3 LLCs. Multiple LLCs, they're not as much of a pain in the butt as some people think they are. When you have multiple LLCs, it basically just means you have multiple tax ID numbers, multiple bank accounts, obviously, and then there's multiple forms in your tax return. Really, once you kind of get it down in a systematic pattern, you very rarely think about the fact that you have 3 different LLCs. But it's really important that you do have one set up separately outside of that. If you have a partnership where one person is going outside to do other things, I really, truly think it is best that they also do their deals under an LLC. So it's perfectly fine, and this may seem kind of odd, but it's perfectly fine to have a contingency in your operating agreement that if they do stuff outside of the partnership, that it must be done within the confines of an LLC or a corporation, probably an LLC. Let's all be honest, it's going to be LLC. It's totally fine to have that contingency in there. It just gives this added level of protection because you're limiting the liability of what Catherine's doing outside of it. And it's sort of creating this bigger like saran wrap around her activities of saying, no, her activities are confined to this. They're confined to this LLC. You can't go to anything else that Catherine Walker's name might be on. So it's this added level of protection that I do consider you put in your operating agreement that Catherine has to have an LLC if she goes out and does other things. Now, of course, in some instances, maybe an LLC doesn't fit. Maybe she's going to go out there and do flipping. LLCs are not very common for flipping. What's more common for flipping is corporations, just because the differences in the tax liabilities. But it should be in there that she has to have an entity that she's using to do these things. That really should definitely be included. Some sort of entity has to be used to do outside real estate activities. Now, I know this is a really very general conversation because in some ways we haven't talked about, well, what happens when one of you wants to leave? What happens if you want to bring in another partner? What happens if you do have an unequal down payment? Does somebody get more ownership than the other? How can one person get ownership? I know there's a lot to be discussed here in partnerships. This is not meant to be an all-inclusive, but this is a good introductory conversation. In a couple weeks, maybe a month or so, I'll come back with another conversation about partnerships and we'll get into those trickier items regarding partnerships. As always, if you guys have questions or podcast suggestions, please hit me up over on Landlord Chick on Instagram. Partnerships, this is actually a long coming viewer request for this one. I got a request back in May for this, and it took me a little bit to get to it. But this was another one that was viewer requested. So please send me your suggestions for what you want to hear about We really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next week.